All right. And welcome back, you guys, to the Self Selecting Podcast. I am your host, Corey Hagman. Thank you for being here. Thank you for tuning in. We got a good topic today, and that is hair loss, hair thinning. This isn't going to be like my hair care routine, if we can even consider me having a routine. This is more so to just kind of pull the veil back on the thing that I find could be causing a lot of that progression, that acceleration of reduction in hair density that we see, and expectedly, like we know at certain ages, like these things will occur. But I guess like really the reason I wanted to make this video is because a lot of people associate, they're like, well, when I start to see these things happen, like that's my indication I'm in perimenopause, or I'm doing something wrong and I need to fix it, or I have an autoimmune condition. And realistically, like this video shouldn't be taken as like a diagnosis. Use it for what you will. But what I'll say is that like now, being in my 30s, it's something that like with skincare, I do want to be mindful of like, okay, am I doing things that are causing an acceleration in which I'm gonna start showing signs of aging? And specifically when it comes to hair loss, hair thinning, I really haven't used enough PEDs or have a hormonal profile that like puts me at risk for androgenic alopecia, via using steroids. But what I'll say is that steroids aside, PEDs aside, there is a much bigger culprit, a much more prevalent culprit that I think a lot of you guys watching this now, and myself included, kind of fall victim to, that directly ties into hair quality, hair length, hair density, and can really like be upsetting and be something that like vastly changes the landscape of your hair. And if that's something that you consider a part of your femininity, I very much consider it a part of mine, then, what's the harm in getting educated on it? So, what I'll say first and foremost, I get all of my information from Chris Wenzel. He's the blowout professor on YouTube. Um, I feel like he does a very honest and fair job of depicting like what it actually takes to grow your hair longer, faster, and he in a very tactful and, like, respectful way, kinda dismantles, like, big hair care, like how he refers to it, which I love that, and just helps the consumer make sense, and, like, it's very much aligned with, like, my style of content is, like, empowering the consumer, making sure that, like, you understand if you're taking these risks, like, here's the potential outcome, but also, like, here are the big levers that we should be focusing our attention on, not the minutia. So definitely, if you're looking for like routine and tips and those kind of things, product recommendations, go check his channel out. Very big fan of the content he puts out. I think it's very empowering for the consumer. And I was watching a video of his, I don't think it was a recent video, but it was like the best kept secret to grow your hair out. And I love that in it, I mean, it was brief, but he did capture that like a big, big contributor to hair thinning, early hair thinning, hair loss, is in fact your hormonal landscape, your hormonal profile. And I felt like, I'm like, well, yes, in our space, in the fitness space, we have a lot of people who are like, oh, you're having hair loss, just start finasteride. Okay, you're, experiencing androgenic alopecia, we just need to put in spironolactone. And there's this idea that like, hey, let's just throw all these either anti-androgens or um, different kind of drugs that we can essentially like we can curb that. But I think that still really like misses the point of understanding like, okay, here's the cause. And while at a certain point in our life we can't really endogenously support really the hormonal profile that we have in our earlier years in life. But I think a lot of people don't understand, like, really, the things that are leading to that early progression of hair loss, supplements aside. So that's really what I wanna talk about today is, like, not, not giving credence to, like, hey, like, maybe there is room for improvement in your actual hair care routine. Maybe there are things that, you should be doing, but it does start intrinsically with hormonally what's going on, and whether these hormones are within a range and specific to you that support better hair growth, or really in a prophylactic sense, the prevention of early hair loss or hair thinning. So that's what we're talking about today. We're not going through hair care trends. I don't have incredible hair. A lot of this shit is fake. I'd love to grow it out more, and I'll work on it. Yeah, but realistically, when it comes to making sure that you have the right tools, it does start with the kind of hormonal profile you're sitting at in the length of time that you're preserving that profile. So we're going to go into the specific hormones today. And really the options at hand in terms of what we can do to modulate some of those, but also the role that those hormones play in shortening your ability to grow your hair out, or even the ones that play a role in your hair shifting from that growth stage into more so of a shedding stage. So I can say, like, I have spent a lot of money on different hair products. I've followed different trends. I've followed different routines, and I think, like myself, I think a lot of us kind of miss the mark because really the beauty industry, it kind of preys on your willingness to just take a supplement, use a product, and have the solution. Whereas in this case, like these things, supplements, products, specifically for hair growth, they might help support healthy hair on the margins, but they're not going to override a broken system. And really, like, you kinda look at it like hair, it's not like muscle, like, you can't just train it to grow faster. It's not about stimulation, it's really about regulation and preservation. Now, if you don't know this, hair operates on a cycle. It's a biological rhythm, that's really governed by those pulsations of varying hormones. So hormones work in a cascade, and, like, we can't just have an issue, typically, we don't have an issue with just one hormone, it's an issue either further up the chain. And even then, we see that issues, or I guess insufficiencies of specific hormones, can then leach over and cause then downstream effects. So as much as, like, I would love if there was just a treatment that I could use regularly, and get another 6 inches of hair, or another 300, 400 grams of hair, those optics, I mean, they're designed for a reason. They're, very much marketing tactics similar to the supplement industry, and they rarely shift the real driver of your cycle, which is your hormones. So that's right. I mean, like, we look at our hormones for, really the ability to determine our reproductive health, and overall just like as a health marker. But when you get into it, estrogen, progesterone, thyroid, cortisol, these aren't just like transient background players. They ultimately dictate the timeline relative to hair growth. And they dictate whether you stay in a growth phase, get pushed into shedding, or kind of just get stuck in limbo. And when you throw different products at the problem, but your hormones are out of sync, you're really not getting yourself closer to the solution. You're kind of just masking it. So oftentimes I will make that analogy whenever we're talking about supplements, or even like TRT, HRT. It's like, in the case that someone's doing a lot of damage, I guess I shouldn't say damage. They are playing a very active role, like an offensive role in shaping the landscape of their hormones. Yeah, you can put things to mask that and cover it up, but you're really not fixing the issue. And really, when it comes to results, or in more of a prophylactic case, which I would say that's kind of where I'm at. Like, I am not having excess shedding. Like, my hormones are in a good range. I'm not androgen dominant. I'm not deep into a contest prep, and I'm not doing things that would really compromise that hormonal landscape. But I also know that as I get older, there are going to be things that do trend downwards, and there are going to be aspects to what I'm able to do endogenously, and that's really what I want to focus on today. The entire approach is focusing on maintenance, preservation, not focusing on, aiming to take leaps and bounds with very little effort. Hopefully, this can give you a little education just on the big levers that you might not realize are playing quite a role in either hair loss or hair thinning. So let's look at the growth cycle. We look at the anagen phase. This is really the time in which, like, you have the most potential to grow longer and thicker hair. So new cells, they divide rapidly at the follicle base, and that actually pushes the hair out longer and thicker. Now, this phase can last 2 years to 7 years, depending on genetics, nutrient status, stress, so allostatic load, and most critically, hormonal balance. So I know that can sound ambiguous. That can almost sound like, oh, like how do we score? Do I have the genetics to grow out very long and dense hair? And that one we aren't really in control of, but there are definitely clues and signs within your hormonal profile through lab work that we can help make sense of any kind of predispositions, which I'm going to get to in a second. Nutrient status. I mean, like we could quite literally look at this. Like there are times in which someone is nourishing their body and they're taking care of their body, and checking all of their boxes when it comes to micronutrient intake, vitamins and minerals. But even within this scope, we also have to consider what are the energy needs and are those energies sufficient enough for the body to really trust that you're in a state to support non-critical functions, which that would be reproduction as well as hair, skin, nail growth. So what shortens that growth phase, the anagen phase? Well, we can look at things like thyroid dysfunction, chronic stress, so elevated levels of cortisol, caloric restriction, low protein diets, androgens. So, yes, like DHT, but also anabolic androgenic steroids, as well as hormonal birth control and even hormonal birth control withdrawals. All of these can prematurely kick your hair out of that anagen phase, forcing it to shut down before it's matured. Now, notice how, like, I'm talking about a lot of external inputs, but even something like androgens, like if you are someone who just has a high level of circulating androgens, even if you have a really good landscape of hormones, meaning that you're having an ovulatory cycle, you could just have a higher propensity to experience these effects on the hair cycle, on the anagen phase specifically, that we want to get ahead of. So, we also have the catagen phase. It's just a transition. It's a wind down period and the follicle, it stops producing new cells. Now, the lower part of the follicle will actually shrink and detach from the blood supply. Now, this is really important because when we're talking about supplementation, we're talking about things that over time can play a role in, I would say, like overall shortening that anagen phase. We can't forget the role that micronutrients play. And if in that anagen phase, if we're very dependent on getting adequate blood flow, yet we're not receiving the appropriate nutrients, so iron specifically, that can actually make it to where we're kicked into this catagen phase sooner. Now, the catagen phase, it is a natural pause. And it typically only lasts a few weeks. But here's the kicker. If your body perceives any kind of threat, illness, trauma, like, yes, it can be quite literally physical surgery or psychological stress. It can kick you into the catagen phase prematurely. And ultimately, this is going to cut growth short and it's going to rush you towards hair shedding, which that brings us to the final phase, the telogen phase. That is when your hair is resting and shedding. This is the follicle's off season, and not in the way that we would think about our off season, where this is our opportunity to grow, but rather this is where the hair strands stay attached, but no new growth is actually occurring. Now, eventually, the strands will fall out to make room for new ones. And typically we see about 10 to 15% of your scalp hairs, they're in this telogen phase at any given time. But what about when something's off? That ultimately can lead this number to spike. So when you're experiencing excess shedding, we're looking for triggers like crash dieting, extreme caloric restriction, iron deficiency, or just generally vitamin nutrient deficiency, new medications, overtraining, or hormonal shifts like stopping birth control, entering perimenopause, or even going through postpartum. Now, each of these can cause a sudden synchronized push of follicles into that telogen phase. Now, what does this mean? It means your hair is going to thin out quickly and recover very slowly. So rather than looking at, you know, what can you do to stimulate growth, it's better suited to almost look at it like, what can I do to preserve the follicles that are in that anagen phase to stay in that phase and to keep each strand alive and nourished and protected long enough to max out their natural potential. And doing that means managing stress and fueling your body in a way that it can support ovulation. So what about in the case that you're not having a period, or that period is very irregular, meaning it is very short, it's very long. There are variations in the cycle length or cycle magnitude. We want to take a closer look at this and we want to confirm that with lab work, which in that case, if you're not having a cycle, well, we can't really narrow down what that optimal time, but it would still make sure that you're getting your estradiol checked, your progesterone checked, as well as really a closer look at total circulating androgens. So DHT, total testosterone, free testosterone, and it really wouldn't hurt to get SHBG done and DHT. Okay, so before I move on, I want to zoom in on what actually shortens your hair growth window and be really specific with these hormones. So, when we look at the anagen phase, yes, it can last a long time, but here's what you need to know. Here's what we need to look at on your labs. So, DHT, this is the main hormone responsible for shrinking the growth phase. Now, this is a very powerful, very strong androgen. It's made from testosterone, and once it binds to the receptors in your hair follicles, three things happen. The anagen phase shortens, the resting phase gets extended, and your follicles begin miniaturizing. So over time, this is going to result in you producing thinner, weaker hairs. Now, this miniaturization leads to progressive loss. So if you've ever experienced weeks where you're just like, yo, like I am under a lot of stress, and in the case of DHT, maybe that conversion of testosterone into DHT in the background is ramping up, whether due to endogenous inputs, changes, or exogenous ones. Now, in women, especially with those with family history of thinning, even on the male side, male pattern baldness, even with normal testosterone levels, this can create a problem if DHT conversion is higher and if the scalp is androgen sensitive. This is why, specifically, when I have individuals who start TRT, I would rather have someone escalate up and maybe sit at that 50 to 60, 70 nanogram per deciliter range, especially in the case that they do have family history of thinning or hair loss, especially early on. But if we see on their lab work that their free test is high, that their SHB is pretty low, and that their DHT is high, then realistically, we're going to titrate them up at a much slower rate and at the rate in which we're not seeing the progression of that DHT conversion. This has to be considered even for individuals who maybe naturally don't have very high free testosterone levels or their DHT is not very high, again, naturally. But once they start TRT, if that dose is very high, we can see free test shoot up. And if we're taking over the counter supplements, that would modulate SHBG, bringing it down, raising free test. This is something that, again, we need to approach with caution. Now, it doesn't mean that ultimately going up to 100 nanograms per deciliter or even close to that is going to result in hair loss or hair thinning. But this is honestly why I would rather titrate up slowly, especially for individuals who are androgen sensitive. So in the case that this is you, maybe you find that sweet spot isn't 90 nanograms per deciliter, but closer to that 60 or even 40 nanogram per deciliter mark. And let's say this is you. You are finding that even at what we would consider modest doses of TRT or anabolics, you're experiencing that androgen driven sensitivity and you're starting to notice your hair thinning or even hair loss. I mean, in the case that we're talking about an anabolic steroid and you're just doing it for a cycle, for performance, or for bodybuilding, the answer probably is going to come down to how much are you willing to tolerate it? And is this something that continues to progress you're going to be okay with? Realistically, the only way we're going to really nip that in the bud is discontinuing the cycle. So I would give it a lot of thought, especially if this is something that you're doing recreationally. But what about in the case that we're talking about someone who's on TRT? What can we do if they do start experiencing hair thinning or hair loss? Now, you'll see a lot of providers will just throw on an anti-androgen, so they'll throw on spironolactone. And personally, I think there is an individual who would fit that profile where that makes sense. But more often than not, I think the answer lies somewhere in even just adjusting the dose so that they're not sitting at such high androgen levels. So, what about cortisol? Cortisol, I've got a lot of videos on it. I've even got a short form video that's super interactive. Definitely go check that out. But if you're not familiar, cortisol is your primary stress hormone. And in burst, it is essential. But when it's chronically elevated, it does start wrecking your system, including your hair. Now, cortisol actually reduces the production of two proteins that kind of act like scaffolding and signaling molecules in the follicle. It also suppresses Gas6, which is a molecule that helps activate dormant hair follicles in their stem cells. It also pushes follicles into an extended rest, so into that telogen phase, preventing growth initiation. So, as you can see, the answer isn't just to throw a bunch of products at your hair. I mean, in actuality, even adding something like HRT might not be the best solution. And realistically, I would try to walk it back and figure out what is the actual culprit. What is the cause behind the chronically elevated cortisol, and what can we do to modify that so that your body is not stuck in this limbo? What about metabolic function? So yeah, thyroid hormone, and this is one that I do have a full comprehensive video on the effects of T4 and T3 and how this can make fat loss a lot easier or inadvertently a lot harder. Now, what you might not know is that your hair follicles are highly metabolic. Now, they're deeply affected by shifts in T4 and T3. So when your thyroid hormones are in balance, they actually promote keratinocyte proliferation. So this kind of acts like building blocks for the hair shaft. They also extend the growth phase. They suppress premature follicle death, which, I mean, sounds great. And a lot of people fall into this trap where, maybe they go through phases where their lab work shows they're hypothyroid. So they think, okay, let's just start exogenous thyroid support. So T4 and T3, or exclusively T4 or T3. Now, this is where people really go wrong. Too much thyroid medication, especially T3, can actually speed up the entire hair cycle. This can cause strands to cycle out too fast and shed prematurely. Bottom line, more isn't always better. And I don't find many people, healthy individuals who are using thyroid support in some form or fashion, typically needing to go over 25 micrograms of T3. And even within that scope, I mean, I'll say like going up to 25 micrograms of T3 for some people is very much in that territory of being too strong. So keep an eye on it. If you're on thyroid support and you're like, well, I just want to be able to maintain a leaner physique, or realistically, I like that I have a little bit more energy. We can't overlook the fact that there are markers that we can very easily track and make sense of that would indicate whether you're now pulling from hypo to normal to now hyperthyroid. So we want to look at that TSH. And personally, for me, I tend to see most people feel best right at that 1.0 or slightly under that, but it's usually that zero point 0.5. And that's not a hard line in the sand. Some people experience these symptoms at 0.7 or zero point 0.8 or even 1.0. But realistically, when I start to see numbers under zero point 0.5 for TSH, if I don't feel great about that. And I'm always following up the questions like, okay, like, do you feel like this is impeding any kind of recovery? Do you feel like this is hindering your sleep? Are you noticing any kind of acceleration in hair shedding, even like nail breakage? Just little things here and there that, can go missed oftentimes, but we want to keep an eye out on this, especially those who are supplementing, because oftentimes the thought is more is better. But with this, there very much is a ceiling, and that ceiling is dictated by your individual homeostatic clock. So we also got to pay attention to IGF-1 and insulin. Now, these don't get talked about enough in regards to hair loss, but they are crucial. IGF-1 is going to be crucial in supporting cell survival, and specifically when we're looking at the signals in the follicle, it's also going to suppress catagen entry, and it's also going to increase local growth factor activity specifically around the follicle. So, in layman's speak, if your metabolism is underfueled, if you're finding that you're in that perma diet cycle where you don't really know why you're staying this lean or why you're restricting food, but it feels like the thing you should do, yet you are experiencing some kind of degree of hair loss or hair thinning, this might actually be where the answer lies. And we're talking about like overtraining, low carb diets, even insulin resistance. You're in a way kind of cutting off the supply line to your hair. Now, what about estrogen? This one is huge as it enhances follicular lifespan. Now, this is why during pregnancy, when estrogen levels are sky high, women often notice thicker, denser hair. Estrogen actually extends that anagen phase. It increases hair shaft diameter and it does reduce overall shedding. But especially in the postpartum phase, once estrogen drops, or in the case of, let's say, someone who's stopping birth control or someone who's taking something to modulate estrogen, even something over the counter like DIM or calcium glucarate. And of course, obviously during menopause, those benefits, those proestrogen benefits, they kind of disappear. And it's also about ratios. So low estradiol relative to free test increases that risk of androgenic miniaturization. So when we look at someone who's in an extended fat loss phase or someone who is getting super lean, it's very undernourished, maybe they're getting on stage, maybe they're using things that intentionally bring estrogen down in the presence of very high androgens, this isn't doing your hair any favors. And even if, like, technically your free test is within range or your total test is within range, but estradiol is lower, things can technically come back normal. And depending on where you are in your cycle length, that might be given the green light by your provider or your coach. But we really have to look at the ratios here, especially if you're someone who is symptomatic and currently seeing signs of hair loss or hair thinning. Now, another big player that oftentimes gets overlooked is prolactin. And although this one is mostly known for its role in lactation, it also interacts with the hair follicles. And we really have to look at it in the case that it's elevated because elevated prolactin can delay anagen entry, it can trigger premature catagen, and it can blunt that follicular signaling in a way similar to cortisol. Now, this can be a hidden player in chronic hair loss caused by medications, pituitary dysfunction, or chronic stress exposure. So, when we're looking at things zoomed out, overall, these are levels that, in the case that you're experiencing symptoms of hair thinning, hair shedding, hair loss, or overall you're just noticing the integrity and the porosity of your hair is declining or just different than what you were once used to, it's absolutely worth getting these hormones checked and not just giving, the green light if your provider is like, yeah, you're healthy, you're in shape, you're in range, like, what's the problem? But really taking these under a microscope and comparing them to other relevant values. The reality is, when your hormones are in check, when your metabolism is fed, and the follicular environment stable, growth isn't random, it's inevitable. And that's when we need to consider, okay, how do we get you from where you are to a point where you can begin to see those changes on a regular basis? Now, I don't think any of y'all will be surprised about this, but I think if you're seeing symptoms of hair loss or hair thinning, and it's something that you're looking to correct, then we need to have a baseline. We need to have data that supports, okay, this is the current amount of shedding or thinning that is present. And I think, for one, you can look at hair shed in a brush. You can look at it relative to when you take a shower, how much hair actually falls out, and you can kind of compare day to day. Obviously, in the case like you've gone 2 days between a shower versus 5 days, you're going to see probably more shed when you go longer. You also have to consider like how delicate you're being with your hair. There's a lot of people, and I'm just going to speak to my own experience. For a long time, I didn't realize how rough I was being with my hair until a stylist pointed out, like, hey, like starting from the scalp and brushing down, like you're causing a lot of damage. And like, if there are any knots, like those strands are probably going to break. And if they're in the anagen phase, which it's not really something they said, but I mean, now at this point, it makes sense. Like, okay, like I'm kind of losing those opportunities because those hairs are just breaking or being quite literally pulled out. So, realistically, I think there does need to be some ownership even in like how you take care of your hair. So, tight hairstyles, pulling your hair back, having it in a ponytail, like a really tight ponytail or bun, having it in clips. I can tell you, like, yes, extensions, I don't wear them every day. I wear them almost exclusively for filming or like speaking events, things like that. And realistically, like this is the most in my life that I've worn clip-in extensions. But in the case that you have clip-ins or you have different types of extensions, like I guess the sewn-in ones would be the other ones I'm referring to, those are putting a constant pull, a tug on the actual hair shaft itself. So it could be something to consider. I love my extensions, but I also know I'd probably be seeing a much bigger increase in hair loss and thinning, specifically around the crown, if I was wearing them regularly, and also even just like the positioning and hair styling. So I'm not someone who is afraid of heat. I have pretty straight hair to begin with, kind of wavy, but realistically, just being mindful of how much damage am I incurring whenever I do style my hair. And I mean, like using a heat protectant, that's a good way to, form some kind of safeguard, but also being mindful, okay, if your hair is already damaged, how much heat are you applying or how much further damage are you causing? So, in the case of coloring your hair, which don't come for me, I'm not saying to not color it, but especially in the case you're doing this very regularly and you're doing it to areas of the scalp that you're already seeing thing occur, it could be worth deciding whether or not you are willing to risk that progressing if that's actively playing a role, which I mean, realistically, I've had good stylists who've been like, "Hey, yeah, you don't color your hair. Like it you have natural hair and like if you want a different color, sure, but like you're probably not going to see improvements in like hair quality, especially if you were to go super, super light or begin to color it very frequently." So I'll stay in my lane though. That's not again not my area of expertise, but we also have to look at like, okay, in the instance of someone who is um very concerned with hair loss. I've seen this with clients before where they do run into like picking issues where they're constantly touching their hair, running their hair fingers through their hair, and even at night, like they're finding themselves like, oh, I think their hair follicle is about to fall out, and they just end up like pulling it very passively. This is something I haven't experienced myself, but very similar to like skin picking, skin touching. It is not conducive with wanting to see this reduction in hair loss. So if that's the case, I mean, like there's definitely services and like I'm sure that there's information online on ways to kind of replace that habit. But oftentimes, like when I have someone who's very concerned about like let's say their skin or their hair, part of the conversation is like, okay, like um, how many touch points are you actually having on it per day? And like, are they positive or are they negative? Like, are you doing things that actually cause more trauma or are you doing things that allow, just leave it alone, that allow it to kind of do its thing? And that's where, again, like that would be under the guise of a professional if you have like a compulsion or if it is like more OCD. But um, I'll say I've had several clients who've been like, I noticed this, but I also can, like, trace it back. I mean, the more stressed I am, the more I pull and tug at my hair and the rougher I am with it. So again, if that's the case, that would fall under that category of, like, a behavioral change that we wanna make. Just like if you're wearing your hair, in a little, like, pineapple bun or, like, a very tight ponytail or a clip like I do. I can tell you, like, switching from a rubber band to a clip or to a scrunchie, it's been largely positive, but I also have to be mindful of like the higher up I go on my head, like that can definitely lead to then like the nape of my neck, that hair being more prone to breakage, just because again, a lot of tension on that specific part of my head. Here's the most critical piece most people overlook. You can't compare your hair from when you're 25 to when you're 40. You can't compare your hair from when you're in prep to when you're in off season to where a phase of your life where you're not getting any sleep to where you're getting a ton of sleep. And that's where I think it's important to be very realistic. If you're in a phase of life where stress is very high, or you're very malnourished in the case of a fat loss phase or contest prep, or you're going through perimenopause or actually menopause, we have to, have realistic expectations, but at the same time, understand that like the body is always shifting and our hormones do evolve. And as much as like we want to preserve as much hair as we can, just like with skincare, it's more about like the best skincare hack is to not put yourself in positions where we're experiencing skin damage. So using sunscreen from a very early age, taking care of your skin. And it's kind of the same with hair. It's like putting yourself in a position where it's getting enough of the right nutrients and you're putting your body in a position where it can support hair growth, which kind of comes back to like the epitome of female health is ovulation. So whether you want kids or not, it's like we need to have an ovulatory cycle. So if you're taking something that would prevent ovulation, such as hormonal birth control, or you're exposing yourself to conditions like contest prep super regularly where it's blunting your ability to ovulate, this is absolutely something that we have to consider as a potential culprit and also an opportunity for improvement if improvement is important to you. All this to say, almost any major shift in internal physiology can affect your hair cycle, but other triggers that oftentimes go overlooked, new antidepressants, stimulants, anticonvulsants, immunosuppressants, or biologics, as well as autoimmune flare ups or undiagnosed thyroid disorders. So, if you start to notice that your shedding is spiking and you've changed nothing topically and you feel really good that, this isn't a behavioral thing that's caused an excess in shedding, I would start looking internally and I would run labs. I would talk to a prescribing physician. I would go see a dermatologist. And the earlier that you catch it, the easier that it could be to fix. You guys, thank you so much for watching. As always, I appreciate you tuning in, and I will see you in the next one.